I will request our principal, Dr. Pradeep Maiti, to give a welcome address.
Thank you. ইংরেজি বিভাগের আজকের এই যে আলোচনা, এতে আমি সবাইকে স্বাগত জানাচ্ছি আমার কলেজের পক্ষ থেকে এবং আমার পক্ষ থেকে। আর অভিনন্দন জানাচ্ছি আমাদের ইংরেজি বিভাগের সমস্ত অধ্যাপকদের এবং তার সাথে আমাদের IQAC কোঅর্ডিনেটর ডক্টর সন্দীপন সেন, তিনি ইংরেজি বিভাগের অধ্যাপকও বটে। এছাড়া এই আলোচনার আয়োজনে রয়েছে আমাদের সেমিনার কমিটি, তার কনভেনারও রয়েছেন, তাকেও আমি অভিনন্দন জানাচ্ছি এটার জন্যে। আর আমাদের অন্যান্য শিক্ষক শিক্ষিকা, শিক্ষাকর্মী, ছাত্রছাত্রী যারা এর সাথে যুক্ত, সকলকেই আমি স্বাগত জানাচ্ছি। আর কৃতজ্ঞতাও জানাচ্ছি এটা অ্যারেঞ্জ করার জন্যে। কৃতজ্ঞতা জানাচ্ছি আমাদের যে পরিচালন সমিতি, তার যে সভাপতি, সব সময় আমাদের পাশে থাকার জন্যে। আজকে এই যে আলোচনা আয়োজন করা হয়েছে, এটা বিশেষত সিলেবাসের সাথে, ইংরেজি ছাত্রছাত্রীদের সিলেবাসের সাথে যুক্ত, সুতরাং তাদের ক্ষেত্রে এটা খুব উপযোগী হবে। এবং এই আলোচনা যেটাতে আমরা আজকে পেয়েছি এক্সপার্ট হিসেবে নীলাদ্রি বাবুকে, তাকে আমার আন্তরিক অভিনন্দন। তার এই সময় দেওয়ার জন্য আমি তার কাছে খুব কৃতজ্ঞ। আবল তাবল প্রসঙ্গে আমার কিছু বলার নেই, আমি তো সাহিত্যের লোক নই, কিন্তু আমরা সবাই ছোটবেলায় এই জিনিস পড়েছি। মানে এই বক কি করে বকচ্ছপ হচ্ছে, তার অনুবাদ কেমন হবে, এইটা আমরা জানার জন্য, বা হাঁসঝাড়ু কেমন অনুবাদ হবে। আমি সকালেই সন্দীপন বাবুর সাথে এটা কথা বলছিলাম যে এর অনুবাদ কেমন হবে। সত্যিই এটা আমরা জানার জন্য, খুব শোনার জন্য খুব উদ্গ্রীব। আবারও আমি সবাইকেই স্বাগত জানিয়ে এবং আমার নমস্কার জানিয়ে আমার বক্তব্য শেষ করছি। শুরু করা যাক তাহলে। ধন্যবাদ।
Thank you, sir. Now I'll take only 2 minutes to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker, Niladri Roy, is an engineer by training from Bengal Engineering College, Shibpur. It used to be Bengal Engineering College, Shibpur. Now it's a university. He is a full-time practicing technologist based in Silicon Valley, California. His interests outside of his profession and occasional experimentation with writing include photography, piloting, single-engine aircraft, and high-altitude trekking in the Sierras, Himalayas, and equatorial Africa. He is the author of the book Everest Base Camp Track, Kathmandu and the Ascent of Kalapathar, which has been published by from San Francisco in 2008. And I'll also like to tell all of you that he has translated very wonderfully. It's a very wonderful translation of Sukumar Ray's Abol Tabol. As our principal has rightly said, it's not easy to translate Abol Tabol into English or into any other language for that matter. But he has successfully done so, and now we will hear from him his encounter with Abol Tabol and the challenges of translation. And I'll also take a minute to welcome Dr. Akhoy Das, who is my childhood friend and who has been instrumental in introducing our main speaker of this evening to me. So over to our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Maiti and Dr. Sen. And of course, Akhoy, I can see you on camera. And Akhoy and I have been at engineering college together. We're from the same batch. And very nice to see you again. And I've been informed that the language of today's presentation needs to be in English. Given the nature of the topic, I will be switching between English and Bengali all the time. And I do understand from the participants there's at least one non-native Bengali speaker by the look of it. And I'm hoping that you will understand Bengali enough to follow the presentation. And my other request is, if at any time you find that any of the explanations are in English are getting difficult, please inform your faculty who might be able to send me a message through the message window, in which case I will alter the language at that point. So with that, I would like to start presenting my screen. And give me a moment while I get that done. And I'd like some feedback whether you can see it or not when you see it. I need some feedback whether the screen is visible or not.
না দেখা যাচ্ছে, it's well seen.
Thank you. Thank you. তো এটা ফুল স্ক্রিন মোডে দেখলেই আপনাদের আমার মনে হয় সুবিধা হবে। And essentially what it deals with, the topic today deals with obviously the title is an encounter with Abol Tabol and challenges of translation. But essentially the objective of today's discussion is firstly to appreciate the translation challenges of Abol Tabol, but within the context of modern translation studies. And I'll come to that in a moment why we want to do that. And while we're doing it, we will examine which elements of translation studies apply and why they apply to this translation. And we will discuss the applicable elements and their examples within Abol Tabol. So this is going to take the largest part of our presentation, but we will use maybe perhaps 10% of our time to illustrate the importance of translations like this to comparative literature, with examples in the area of linguistics, history, culture, politics, philosophy, arts, and sciences. One word to the wise, while we go through this presentation, this set of PowerPoint slides was created using an American version of PowerPoint, and I have kept the American spellings, which will differ from the spellings we are used to in India. But I thought that was an easier thing for me to do rather than PowerPoint give me n number of errors. The way the presentation has been formulated, we should be spending around 50 minutes in discussion, leaving approximately 10 minutes for questions and answers. So I urge you to make the most of that time if you need it. So while we go through this presentation, we are going to look at numerous examples from Abol Tabol. We'll get a chance to compare different translations. We'll examine things like rhyme and meter, and we will appreciate something called problems within translations. And we will look at all of this in the context of translation studies that you see right in the center of your screen. And the reason for doing this is that we need a structure to this presentation. Otherwise, very easily, this can degenerate into a very rambling discourse on me telling you why I think my translation is the greatest, and we certainly don't want that. So what we want to do is look at the elements of translation studies that apply to this translation. Now, what I want to make clear is I do not want to make this an overly theoretical discussion, and I will take no more than 3 slides to introduce this topic. And it's not necessary to remember this entire structure. But translation studies came of its own actually in the 70s of the last century. In 1972, a gentleman by the name of James Holmes published a seminal paper where he did not map out the translation studies in pictorial form as you see here, but that's something that other people have gone and done. I myself have adopted this table or this hierarchy from his work. But that was the first time when translation studies started being looked at from in a scientific manner, with branches described and elements described in the way you see it on your screen. And just a word of caution over here that I don't think this is complete. For example, that the whole purpose of this was to create a general theory of translation. And you'll notice that there's something called general and partial over here. This sort of can be compared to Einstein's general theory of relativity and special theory of relativity, the partial theory of translation studies compared to the special theory. But the very fact that general theory is hanging on one side by itself should give you a clue that this requires some modification. However, what we're going to focus on are the green boxes. The dark green boxes are things that applied directly to my translation, and the light green boxes of product and area are ones that apply sort of peripherally. But maybe at this point in time, we want to look at what do these things mean and why do they apply? So why these elements apply? Starting with text type. Text type in translation studies really talks about whether your text is a scientific journal, whether it's sort of even a dictionary, whether it's a manual for operating machinery, whether it is in prose or whether it is poetry. So obviously in our case, we are dealing with one of those restricted text types, the restriction being that it is poetry. Time usually applies, and especially in the case of Abol Tabol, because as a 100-year-old text, Abol Tabol may set certain limits on translation. I'll explain that with an example. Suppose you were translating a novel where your protagonist was talking to somebody else on the telephone, and this novel was written in the 1930s, you would be well advised to make sure that it was a landline and not a mobile phone. And anachronistic problems like this are what are classified within time issues of translation studies. The third thing we want to look at is what translation studies defines as a problem. And this applies very, very well to Abol Tabol translations, because Abol Tabol is full of idioms and proverbs for proper nouns like palaram bishash and onomatopoeia or onukar shabdo বা dhonibritti, where the sound shai shai pon pon is used to describe chute jai. So these kind of things become very difficult when you want to translate them from one language to another. And one very important thing that we are going to look at all throughout our presentation is policy or translation policy. In this particular case of my translation, there were a set of self-imposed criteria that I established prior to the translation. And my reason for this was I wasn't really happy with the existing translations of Abol Tabol. There have been at least 3 major translations of Abol Tabol before this. One, it was in 1970, translated by the author's son, Satyajit Ray, and that was published from Writer's Workshop. I think that deals with about 25 to 30% of the poems. Then in 1987, Professor Shukanto Chaudhary, who is currently Professor Emeritus at Jadavpur University, he did a translation. And that translation, I think, addressed almost 70% of the poems. And the third one was by a lady by the name of Sampurna Chatterjee, who in 2004, through Puffin Books, published a translation which included, among other things, about 30 to 40%, or perhaps even close to 50% of Abol Tabol poems. Now, all these were good translations in their own right, but I did not like the fact that I wasn't really getting the original flavor of Abol Tabol. I do not profess to have, established that in my translation, but I came closer to what I wanted than I was getting in those translations. But I could not do that unless I established certain translation policy. So we are going to examine translation policy as the slide next to it before we actually dive into the actual examples. Process is one of those light green boxes. Process always applies and is related to the thought process in the mind of the translator. We'll spend just about one slide on process. There are 2 other things. One is called area, which is also a light green box. Area usually means geographic area, and it applies here to a lesser extent. And when I say geographic area, I might mean that there's a difference perhaps in trying to translate Abol Tabol for Indian audiences in English, or American audiences in English, or maybe perhaps even British audiences, but Western audiences, that's in a different geographic area, a different linguistic community, if you will. And translating Abol Tabol for Europe can be very different for translating Abol Tabol for America and the rest of the rest of Britain, because Britain and America are essentially monolingual societies. Yes, there is a fair amount of Spanish in the US, but the largest number of speakers speak English. Whereas in Europe, if you walk into a bookstore in, say, Belgium, you would find that maybe 30% of the translations are there in English, but 70% of the books are translations. You will not find that in a store in America. You will find that almost 100% of the books are in English and very few translations. So societies, depending on what kind of languages they are used to culturally, they can determine how you're going to translate a particular text. And the final one is product. Product always applies, and product is not something that you take care of when you're doing the translation. It's more about other people's evaluation of your specific translation. And if you were the one who set the policy, and then you might want to check your product against that policy. But most importantly, as I said, what influenced my Abol Tabol or my version of translation was policy. So we want to look at that in a little bit of detail. So what is translation policy, and can we look at translation policy together with text type? We already know that the text type in this case is poetry. And if I were to sum up my policy for translating this particular set of poetry, I would say it was to retain the original flavor. But we can break that up a little more. This poetry has many attributes, could be rhyme and rhythm, which we're very familiar with, but there in the case of Abol Tabol was also humor. Certain moods were created while these poems were being written. And what makes Abol Tabol either more interesting or more problematic is that almost 100% of the poems in Abol Tabol are actually satire, which means that they can have double meanings. So if we were to break down our policy for rhyme, we might decide that we want to preserve the original rhyming schemes that were adopted in the Bangla version. We might say that we want to retain the original humor. Retaining the original humor is not something that necessarily follows from translating the text, as we shall see. We might also decide that we want to evoke the original mood. And rhythm, we started off with a lofty goal that we will try and maintain the original meter as far as possible. This is extremely difficult to do, but we can do it by managing cadence, as we shall see as we go through the presentation. And satire meant that I wanted to comprehend at least the existence of dual meanings, meaning that I did not need to explain the satire in Abol Tabol, but if someone were to use my text to illustrate that there were dual meanings or there was satire in Abol Tabol, it should be possible to do. So obviously by this time you can realize that the policy you adopt can place additional restrictions on the natural attributes of text type. So natural attributes of text type like poetry is usually rhyme and rhythm. But when you say, I want to translate humor, I want to translate mood, or I want to translate satire, you are adopting a policy that can place additional restrictions. And in this particular case, it did. So that's enough theoretical discussion. And we are going to dive right into the first topic, which is the original rhyming schemes in Abol Tabol. And now we have started with examples. The simplest rhyming scheme in Abol Tabol is the couplet. So, হাঁড়ি নিয়ে দাঁড়ি বুখো কে যেন কে বৃদ্ধ রোদে বসে চেটে খায় ভিজে কাঠ সিদ্ধ বৃদ্ধ সিদ্ধ, very easy. So each of these rhyme with each other. So a couplet is really a pair of lines that rhyme with each other. And that's the simplest type to translate. Where it gets a little more complex is when we see rhyming schemes like the sestet. The sestet is of the type where you have A, B, C, D, E, F, where A, B, and C rhyme, D, E, and F rhyme. But Abol Tabol uses a special form called the Spanish sestet, or what the Spanish people called the secatilla. They happen to pronounce Koi Muddhanashwar Q when they write X, exactly like we do. So Shekhopior. So in the case of the Spanish sestet, you have a rhyming scheme like thap thap paeshe, nachtoshe aeshe. So both of these rhyme with each other. So A and A. And then we have gal bhora chilo tar phutti. So we find that phutti doesn't rhyme with aeshe and paeshe anymore. So phutti is a different rhyme, which is B. But when we go to the next line, we find gaitoshe shara din, saregama ting ting. Now these two rhyme with each other, but they don't rhyme with ISA. So they're the fourth type here. I mean the third type here. So it's a C. But on the next line we find Allah de godo godo mutti, which actually rhymes with purti. So a Spanish sestet is of the form A A B C C, but again B. So this was one of the challenges to encounter. And by the way, other translators have done a fairly good job of it before that. I've seen Shampurna Chatterjee do it. I have seen Shukanta Chaudhary do this. So it's nothing really unusual. But a more complex rhyming scheme that Sukumar Ray has used in Violet and Abol Tabol is the Violet. And Violet is much more complex than the Spanish sestet, because here the rhymes actually move from very distinct stanzas. So in one stanza we have A, Paja, Raja, Bhaja, Gilchana. So the first three rhymed, but the last one did not. But when we go to the second stanza, we find Jama, Jama, Nama, and then we find that Milchena, which again rhymes with Gilchena. So here in the Violet, we have a rhyming scheme which is A, followed by C, but again B. So these were some of the translation challenges that you come up with the rhyming schemes in Abol Tabol. But I'd like to point out something which you probably already observed, that when we take something like Rode Ranga Iter Paja and we look at sunburned bricks piled up neat, or we take up something like Gaye Ata Gorom Jama, which is wearing warm wool jerkin, these seem to be almost word for word what Sukumar Ray meant. But if you go and look at Gal Bhora Chilotar Phutti and used to frolic and scamper, those are not word for word translations. They give you the meaning that perhaps the author intended. So hence, this discussion about verbum pro verbo, and that's Latin for word. The French have a different name for it, mot à mot, but this is verbum pro verbo versus sensum pro senso. So we find that perhaps translating the sense, Galvora Chilotar Phutti, into used to frolic and scamper, or Allah de Godo Godo Murti, where you say gleeful, glad, happy camper, and there's something hidden in there that you're probably not seeing. Happy camper is not an expression that you usually find used in India to show somebody happy. However, it's a very, very common expression in both America and England. And since the purpose of this translation was to make Abol Tabol available for those audiences, it seemed like the right thing to do, to slip in something like gleeful, glad, happy camper. But the lines used to frolic and scamper and gleeful, glad, happy camper are both sensum pro senso. They differ very much from wearing warm wool jerkin, which is verbum pro verbo. So there was a gentleman by the name of Eugene Nida. We will talk about a little bit of theories of translation, but we are not going to go into theories of translation. That's a very vast topic in itself. But when I see an opportunity, I will mention that there used to be a theory called equivalence. There still is. And Eugene Nida has proposed the theory of equivalence. So when you say used to frolic and scamper and Galvora Chilotar Phutti, one is equivalent to the other. So going forward, retaining original humor. Now, I did mention that normally you think that this should follow automatically if you have equivalence in the narrative, meaning that if you've translated the story correctly, then the humor should automatically happen. That is usually so, but Abol Tabol is special. in some poems of Abol Tabol, the above isn't necessarily true. And one example, and we don't need to go into great detail, but one example is when humor is created by juxtaposing onomatopoeia, onukar shabdo, with literally interpreted, it's important to know, literally interpreted idiomatic usage. For example, when we say shai shai pon pon, and then we compare it with chute jai, how crazy is that? Because shai shai pon pon is onukar shabdo, whereas chute jai actually is idiom. Or more interesting is when you say khash khash ghash ghash raat kate. There is no such thing in English as the night cuts. There is no such thing in English as sleep break or ghum bhange. There is breakfast, but that's about it. So when we say ghum bhange, ghum to ar bhange na. So what happens is we wake up, but Sukumar Ray created humor by taking ghum bhange literally and applying the onomatopoeic sounds of breakage with bhanga. So dudda churmar. So these are onukar shabdo or onomatopoeia, which were compared with ghum bhanga, but not in the idiomatic sense, in the literal sense. So the humor that was created here was by juxtaposing, that is putting side by side onomatopoeia with literally interpreted idiomatic usage. And this also constituted one of the major challenges in Abol Tabol. So I had to make changes. Like when you say shai shai pon pon and bhoye kan bondho, oi buji chute jay she fuler gandho. So in the Bengali, chute jachchilo fuler gandho. But what I managed to do was take shai shai pon pon, puff puff pant pant, and say this isn't fun. And this isn't fun means like an American kid would say, "Mom, this ain't fun anymore." So when they're running, but the puff puff pant pant is actually now juxtaposed with run, because those are noises that you might make while you are running because you're out of breath. But since there is no way to make smell run, we said that the colors run. Now, in the case of Himpora, I got lucky because, the falling dew and Himpora, they are exactly the same idioms in Bangla and English, and therefore using words, onomatopoeic words for falling was not that difficult. So various degrees of challenge when Sukumar Ray does this. The second case is when a saying or a proverb, also idiomatic in nature, but again has been interpreted in a literal sense to create the humor. So Nara beltolai jay kobar is humor because Nara ekbarer beshi jay na karon mathay bel porechilo. But Sukumar Ray didn't finish Nara beltolai jay kobar as an idiomatic poem. He finished this by interpreting literally the saying Nara beltolai jay kobar. Khelte ashe. So here, if I had to make a translation which made sense in the way Sukumar Ray wanted to do it, first I would have to pick an idiom which is equivalent to Nara beltolai jay kobar, which in English is once bitten, twice shy. Just like Nara dubar beltolai jay na, once bitten, you're shy about approaching that animal again. So now, since Sukumar Ray used Nara beltolai jay kobar in the literal sense at the end of the poem to create humor, I also had to end up interpreting once bitten, twice shy in a literal sense in order to create the humor. Nominally, these things belong under problems in translation studies, as we will see, but these also constitute part of the challenges of Abol Tabol. Now, where it gets a little difficult, or not necessarily difficult, but where the translator needs to be careful, is when evoking the original mood of a scene or a character or the narrator himself. So when you see this Bangla poem, and if I were to read it like this, Nimet Chaya, Jinget Chaya, Tikto Chayar Pak, Je Khabe Bai Obar Gore Dagbe Tahar Nak, it's essentially like Lokhir Pachali. It's the original mood, is that you're hearing prescriptive wisdom being read out from some encyclopedia, the Bangla version of Materia Medica or homely medicine. So that's the feeling that you get when you hear this. So when I made this translation, I had to keep in mind that what Sukumar Ray was trying to do was create that mood, and therefore you have to sort of translate in a way that can be recited similarly. He who imbibes bitter shadows of neem bark and more, good night sleep begets thee and deep sonora snore. So we get an opportunity here to compare this with another well-known translation. The bitter leaf shadow extracting the core induces sound sleep and a musical snore. I can try to read it in the same Lokhir Panchali style, but I kind of hit some jarring notes when I see extracting to the core. And that's a very scientific kind of word. Then when I say the purportry shade by moon I distill to cure the catarrh and get rid of chill, you know, I think I know a whole lot of English. I have to go and look at what the heck does catarrh mean in a dictionary. You don't want to do that when you're translating for kids. You are going to try and get both the original mood and not make it difficult for the reader. So my question is, which translation on the right, one or two, makes you feel closer to that above mood that you're hearing Lokhir Panchali of medicine? To me, it is definitely number one, but number two is not a bad translation either. Because you can say the bitter leaf shadow extracting the core induces sound sleep to the musical snore. You kind of can try and read it and get to the original mood. It's difficult. You have to, the mood doesn't get created for you. You have to create the mood by reading the translation a certain way. So that's another challenge in Abol Tabol. This actually goes beyond the mood of a scene, the mood of a character. So from Kuro Call, you have Bolbo ki ar kole phiki, bolte na pai bhasha. You can see the wonder, you can hear the wonder in the part of the narrator. Bolbo ki ar kole phiki, bolte na pai bhasha. So he is, he's bemused, he's wondering. And when you translate that as inner workings, what can I say, for words I'm at a loss, you can sort of begin to feel that mood of the narrator where he is really amazed. And the second example, where you say, Khuro wale bolbo ki ar hate amar posto lekha. So that's a lament. That's a hahakar that, Khuro is making. Uncle laments, what's left to tell, says clear on my palm. So if I use, instead of inner workings, what can I say, for words I'm at a loss, and if I use, but words can scarce describe the work the learned world has praised, or if I take Uncle laments, what's left to tell says clear on my palm, and compare that with why nothing, he answered, my hand tells the tale, I get equivalence, but I don't adequately get the mood that the original author had intended. And you'll remember a little while ago, we mentioned Eugene Nida and the equivalence theory, that the translated text should be equivalent to the original text. But equivalence has its shortcomings, as we've just demonstrated. It doesn't capture the mood. So there were two other people, Catherine Rice and Hans Vermeer, who in the 90s proposed another theory called the skopos theory. And skopos in Greek means purpose. Actually does not really mean purpose, it means to see, but see in a certain way, and hence the purpose. The word scope comes from skopos. But they theorized, Rice and Vermeer theorized, that equivalence is only one possible relationship among others. You have to have multiple other relationships to achieve what you would like to call adequacy. So this gives us an opportunity to compare two translation theories, equivalence versus adequacy. And now we come to a really vexing problem in translating Abol Tabol. I told you before that translators before me have gone ahead and done the rhymes and the rhyming schemes well, but maintaining original meter, chondo, is very, very difficult. So meter is a measure of rhythm. To explain it to people who may not know it, take the poem by Derozio, To India, My Native Land. So that you will hear multiple times is set in iambic pentameter. Now, I understand that this group is primarily undergraduates, so you may not all know what the heck an iambic pentameter is, but that is necessary for me to explain the rest of it. So let me go through it. So the first line of To India, My Native Land is my country in thy day of glory past. And I've broken it down in two different colors to indicate syllables. So my is a one syllable word, country is a two syllable word. How do you know that's a two syllable word? When the vowel sound changes. And when you say my, there's only one vowel sound, I. But when you say country, you have A and E. Similarly, in the case of glory, you have glow, that is O sound, and re, which is I sound. So anything where the vowel sound changes becomes multiple syllables, and whereas the same sound, the same vowel sound is one syllable. Now we also find that some of these syllables are stressed, the others are unstressed. For example, my is not really stressed. You say my country in thy days of glory past. So in, days, glow, and past are stressed. So if you mark them with X's and slashes, this is what we get. So unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. So if we sort of group them, we find that we have 5 similar groups. So when you have a group which is unstressed followed by stress, that kind of group is called an iamb, and it's called a foot. So there are 5 feet in that line, my country in thy days of glory past. Each foot is of the form unstressed followed by stressed, and hence an iamb, and there are 5 feet. So there are 5 iambs. So since the meter consists of 5 iambs, it's called an iambic pentameter. So we see many variations in Sukumar Ray's poem, and iamb is not the only foot. The opposite of iamb, when you have stressed followed by an unstressed, is called a trochee. And you have even other things where we have stressed followed by unstressed, which is dactylic. But the point here is, while maintaining the original meter is next to impossible between languages that have different roots, if you manage the cadence well, and that's somewhat forgiving. So it's very difficult to really see what's going on in this picture. So I've drawn 2 different circles. The circle on the left represents the Bengali language. This is a tree of languages. And the circle on the right represents the English language. So everything started from what is called, Indo-European roots. But you can see from this diagram that Bengali and English are 2 different sides of this picture. So it's very difficult. There's actual close roots are very, very divergent from the original Indo-European roots. So it's extremely difficult to keep meter straight. But look at 2 different translations of the same stanza of Abol Tabol, which closely approximate the cadence of the original, but not the original meter. But they still make very good translations. The first one is from mine, and the second one is from Dr. Shukanta Chaudhary's. But we start with Bidgute Rattire Gudgute Phaka. And I go mystic bare night quietness lapped. And Chaudhary goes creepy, lonely, silent night. Now, what Sukumar Ray did was he used what is called a dactylic trimeter. Remember we said stressed followed by 2 unstressed is a dactyl, and there are 3 of those. So it's a dactylic trimeter followed by what is called a spondee. Not many people are able to use this well, but a word like phaka does not have a stressed and unstressed syllable. Both syllables are stressed. Phaka, dhaka, chaka are all both stressed syllables, and they are called spondees. So he used a combination of dactylic trimeter and spondee to create this, whereas what I have done is purely something called a trochaic tetrameter. A trochee is a stressed followed by an unstressed, and I have 4 of those. So it's a tetrameter, and it's a trochee, so it's a trochaic tetrameter. What Shukanta Chaudhary has done is he's also used the trochee, but he's used a trochaic tetrameter catalectic, because he also has 4, therefore tetrameter, but the 4th one is incomplete. And when a meter is incomplete, we call it catalectic. Actually, a complex word, comes out of a combination of Greek and Latin. So you heard of anabolism, catabolism. Kata in Greek means to go down or break down and reduce. Lectic is the past participle form of the Spanish legere, the Latin legere, which means to read. So catalectic, lectio comes from lectic. So catalectic actually means an incomplete meter, because it kind of went down. So these are some of the challenges that happen. Now, nobody sits down, or at least I didn't sit down and look at meter to do my translation. I mean, I could have, I was aware of this thing, but it would have been very, very difficult. It probably taken a couple of years just to try and get this. What I did is I approached it from the point of view of cadence, sound. Bidgute raktire gudgute phaka, mystic bear night partner slack. Does it sound good enough? Is it equivalent? Is it also adequate? Move on. That's what I did. But I wanted to explain to you that these exist as challenges in translating Abol Tabol. But where Abol Tabol gets really challenging is where double meanings occur. So we said that Abol Tabol is satire, and we have in Ganer Muto, গাইছে ছেড়ে প্রাণের মায়া গাইছে তেরে প্রাণপণ ছুটছে লোকে চারদিকেতে ঘুরছে মাথা ভন ভন. And we also have another line from the same poem which says জলের প্রাণী অবাক মানি গভীর জলে চুপচাপ. So the way I translate it is, croons like there's no tomorrow, urels up a grand din, people run hither-thither, their heads all in a tailspin. And I also translate the other line as the sea-dwelling, surprising, are quiet and deep read out. Another translation of Abol Tabol, it exists, and there's another well-known translation of Abol Tabol which says, he sings as though he's staked his life. He sings as though he's hell-bent. The people dazed retire amazed, although they know it's well-meant. And I put well-meant in italics, you'll know why. Then the other line is translated as the fishes dive below the lake in frantic search for silence. So fishes and lake are in italics again. Now the blue lines are sort of equivalent and perhaps adequate. The problem comes from somewhere else. And to be fair, the translator of the blue lines wasn't aware of this issue, and so could be forgiven for not taking that into account. But this poem is actually satire or a commentary on the physical shelling of the city of Madras by the German light cruiser Emden. So Emden was a battleship that parked itself in the Bay of Bengal and started shelling Madras in September 1914. And this story is commentary on that. And Vishwalochan's gun is actually symbolism for Emden's guns. Now, nothing about the shelling of the city of Madras could be considered well-meant. So when you translate it, the people dazed retire amazed, although they know it's well-meant, you are committing grave injustice. But as I said, to be fair, the translator was probably not aware that this is the meaning of this poem. The other line of the poem, the sea-dwelling surprising are quiet and deep read out, actually refer to submarines. And Emden was never attacked by submarines. It was finally attacked by an Australian ship called HMAS Sydney, and Sydney actually managed to run Emden to the ground. But Sukumar Ray wondered, why were submarines not deployed? That's why he said obak mani. Joler prani obak mani govir jole chupchap. So you have to take that into account. You cannot suddenly make those joler prani fish because they meant submarines, and you cannot certainly make the Bay of Bengal a lake. So you see the repetition of this in the last poem of Abol Tabol, where Sukumar Ray creates a sort of a confession that in all the poems of Abol Tabol, I have hidden double meanings. And he says, Aloy Dhaka Ondokar. The Aloy Dhaka Ondokar is actually the Ondokar of his satire, covered by the Alo of his Hashorosh. So it's darkness covered by the light. So you cannot translate it as the darkness lists as moonshine wells. So Alo was meant to represent the humor which hides the Ondokar or hidden satire in the poems of Abol Tabol. Darkness was not meant to be dispelled by light, but quite literally covered by it. So these are some of the double meaning problems that can happen. One word to the wise, please do not use words like moonshine to mean moonlight. Moonshine basically means illicit liquor or cholai mod in English. So stick to things like moonlight. Moonlight has no other meaning except when you're using it as a verb. He moonlighted as a waiter in the night, meaning that he had a second job as a waiter in the night. But when sticking to the light of the moon, please stick to moonlight and don't go to moonshine. Now, these are the elements of translation studies that we have examined so far. So we looked at the fact that, yes, it is a restricted text, it's poetry. We looked at certain policies that we put in place that preserve the original rhyming schemes, retain the original humor, evoke the original mood, maintain the meter, and comprehend dual meanings. And that actually takes up the bulk of our discussion. We have a few elements still to go, which is time, area, problem, process, and product. But this will not take up as much time as the earlier discussion did. But let's dive into time and area together. Time refers to the time period when the original was composed, hence our example about the landline and the mobile phone. And area relates to the place or communities for whose relevance a translation policy has been adopted. Relevance is another theory in translation, just like equivalence was there, scopus was there. Relevance was an earlier theory, probably early 1900s by a gentleman called Gut. But anyway, that's irrelevant. An example of time is kate kate thuke kore thakatok shabdo. In my translation, which actually makes an anachronistic error, but I'm okay with it, is wood on wood clacks cacophony rap mix. Now, if your objective is actually to explain to somebody that, hey, you're reading poems translated into English, but which were written in 1915, then you cannot use something like rap mix because that is anachronistic. Something like rap did not exist in that time. So it can be an error. And then I also go and say, inner workings, what can I say? For words I'm at a loss. It straps around one's neck like the mariner's albatross. Now, I just wanted to do it because it seemed something which would appeal to a reader who knew what a mariner's albatross was. It actually comes from the mariner's albatross in Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But it is probably not something I would use if I were translating Abol Tabol for Indian audiences. I was perfectly happy doing this for British and American audiences, but area is something that can be a challenge when you're doing translations. Then Ramu Ho, Damu Ho, Uparar Ghosh Bosh. I've used Tom, Dick, and Harry, for very obvious reasons of area, because Tom, Dick, and Harry is almost idiomatically what's the word I'm looking for? Is synonymous to the Ramsham Jodu of Bangla in the English-speaking countries. Another anachronistic error that I make, and I make it deliberately, is ছুটছে কত খ্যাপার মতো পড়ছে কত চাপা সাহেব মেমে থমকে থেমে বলছে মামা papa. Hurtling amok a multitude, tempting fate in traffic, tourists stare in consternation, a scene chaotic graphic. A purist would come and catch me by the ear and say, what the heck do you mean? What do you mean tourists? Yes, it is anachronistic. It is not what Sukumar Ray meant, but it works for audiences in the US and the UK, perhaps rest of Europe who speak English. But it is an error, and it is a translation challenge in Abol Tabol, which for Indian audience should be approached differently. And then Monesh Shadhe Gaiche Bihag, Bihag to noy, Bosundorag. Now, I could say Bihag and keep these names, but what would happen is an American audience or a British audience will come and say, what is this? I'll probably explain it in a footnote, but in the process, I have borrowed the reader, I have robbed the reader of the enjoyment. So it's easier to just make it a well-recognized European composer called Mozart. So we have Mozart over here. So if we were to reveal a little bit about the process, now I want to be very clear here. Process as described in translation studies is not prescriptive. It is not a way to go and do translations. You have translation, অনুবাদ কইবার কৌশল নহে. This is basically to acquire insight. This is a post-translation activity, not a pre-translation activity. But translation studies uses process to acquire insight into the thought process in the mind of the translator. Some of the thought process you've actually seen when you heard of translation policy. So I had sensum pro senso in mind. I had equivalence or scopus in mind. I did check, is verbum pro verbo, or pronouncing it in the Latin way, is verbum pro verbo really necessary? I paid attention to rhyming scheme, and I sort of talked about relevance, but process is something that I can sort of give you a glimpse into how I did it. Again, please understand, this is not prescriptive. This is not the way to go and do translations, but this is to look at the insight of how I responded to challenges. So suppose you were required to translate Hatti Matim team, Tara Mate Pare team, Tader Khara Duto Sing, Tara Hatti Matim team. Then maybe you have two cases. In case one, you consider Tara Mate Pare team as the only relevant portion. In case two, you consider that Tara Mate Pare team and Tader Khara Duto Sing are both relevant to your audience. So let's look at these two cases. So you can imagine this as a three-step process. So say you started out by translating Tara Mate Pare Dim arbitrarily. Why did you want that? Because, okay, that's the most relevant portion. And perhaps your product looked like, in fields they lay eggs. Now, the moment you write eggs, you're kind of committed, because team, deem, sheen, team, the eggs is going to decide what your rhyming word is now going to be. So you must use eggs as the rhyming sound for Tader Khara Duto Sing. And say you translate it to their arms are like pegs. Now notice that there is no connection between shing and arms. We're talking of two completely different things. But we said earlier that shing was not relevant, so we didn't care. And now the last thing that we have to do is we have to invent a substitute name for Hatti Matim team that rhymes with eggs. So I invent a substitute name, say daddy long legs, in fields they lay eggs, their arms are like pegs, their daddy long legs. But if you have the second case where you also start out by translating Tara Mate Pare Dim arbitrarily, and you say the eggs in fields lay, obviously the question is why the eggs in fields lay, why not in fields they lay eggs like you did before? And you would be right if you asked me that question. And in reality, it probably began the same way as the first one began, with in fields they lay eggs. But maybe I found out during the second step that that's not going to work. So my second step is now I have to ensure that the sense of Tader Khara Duto Sing is preserved. And my rhyme must now make sense of both. Then I keep trying and I figure that if I use in fields they lay eggs, it doesn't work. But if I use horns on head display and I write their eggs in fields lay, perhaps I can get them to rhyme. And then only the third thing that's left is to invent a substitute name for Hatti Matim team, which rhymes with lay, which I say in this case is Horty Morty May, their eggs in fields lay, horns on head display, they are Horty Morty May. So both of these are sort of acceptable products, but the second product can be acceptable either in case one or case two, but the first product can only be accepted in case one. But again, this is not a prescription for translation, but this is how scholars try to figure out what was the translator thinking and get some insight. Now, this is the hardest part of Abol Tabol. We're coming very close to our appointed hour, so I will not spend too much time on this because we already talked about problems caused by idioms, and we already talked about problems caused by onomatopoeia. But let's focus for a moment on problems caused by proper nouns. Palaram Bishas, Khelonako Nishas. Now, there is no other reason why Palaram Bishas was used except to rhyme with Nishas. Similarly, Bhutonath was used to rhyme with Kupokat. In fact, Sukumar Ray didn't even use Bhutnath because he knew that he was going to miss one syllable. So he added a syllable and made it Bhutonath. Now, there is no way a translator is going to be able to translate this. And therefore, I took the same path that Sukumar Ray took. I changed all the names. I used Spanish names, and I used the names to rhyme. So Victor Delgado, Tornado. Similarly, because I have used Spanish name, I had to change Bhutonath to Pablo, and we have other people like Miguel and so on and so forth in this poem. But this is just to explain that, yes, proper nouns can also create a challenge. I'm not going to go into onomatopoeia again because I think we discussed this at length. But when onomatopoeia is used along with literally interpreted idiomatic expressions, we have a problem. And we also looked at hidden messaging as well. So moving quickly away from problems to product. Product is simply and evaluation of what you did. This is not something that you have much control over in terms of what people think. So these are examples from the back covers of books. So somebody thought that Shukanta Chaudhary's Select Nonsense of Sukumar Ray succeeds in recapturing, I don't understand why recapturing would have been enough, but succeeds in recapturing the peculiar nuances of Sukumar's style. So that's one way people look at your product. So somebody looked at Shampurna Chatterjee's lively translation captures the magical nonsense groove of the Bengali original. Now, I would like to get this reviewer up and say, what the heck is nonsense groove? But it doesn't matter. He or she thought that this is what happens. And somebody else thought that mine was line accurate rendering. So it depends on the individual reviewers on which aspect of the product they are focusing on, and they will focus on aspects that matter to them the most. So having come there, we want to go and do a little bit of a recap. Till now, we've looked at text type, we've looked at translation policy, time, problem, process, and we've examined the translation challenges of Abol Tabol in the context of translation studies. So that I promised would be the bulk of the presentation. We have only one slide necessarily to go, which sort of explains what is the importance of doing all this in the field of something called comparative literature. Now, it's very coincidental that tomorrow is the anniversary of the words world literature. I think this was coined by a German gentleman. The name escapes me at this moment, but it was on 31st January 1825. But comparative literature is the study of world literature which compares and contrasts national literatures. So there could be literature which emanates, say, from Israel, literature that emanates from India, literature that emanates from Britain. And can we compare and contrast these to intersect linguistics, history, philosophy, politics, and so on, and see what is the importance of doing these translations. So in linguistics, we have an interesting situation. We have words borrowed from, English to Bengali, Bengali to English here and there. For example, the word dinghy in English comes from dinga, which is absolutely has no other roots other than Bengali. And when I was growing up, and actually the generation before me, Ishtupit was is sort of something you call somebody, galagali jite. We also, as when I was growing up, we even had Captain Haddock type galagals like idiot, nonsense, onion, biscuit, compost card. But that's a different thing. But Ishtupit was something that was used, and it had been borrowed from the English language with the English word stupid. And when we translate, maybe the European scholars get an example of, oh, that's how words were assimilated. At the bottom of the screen, you will find something from 1874. So the Indian Chivalry, which was the Indian version of Punch magazine, somebody wrote a poem in obviously stilted English, not so grammatical English, but the objective was humor over here. So they wrote, and they mixed words from English, from Bengali and English, and it said, "Bapre, this time you have made too beautiful a picture of me. Shivari Bahadur is squatting was squatting on branch of tree." So never mind how ungrammatical and stilted that English sounds, the effect that they wanted to achieve was this. And then just like linguistics, we have, poems like we just saw Ganil Bhuto was about Emden shelling Madras. Similarly, we have poems like Katguro, Gomp Churi, Larai Khapa. These were all written about events of World War I. And it provides European scholars with a uniquely Indian perspective to World War I. Political poems are Baburam Shapure, Shabdakalpa Dhrum, Ekushi Ain. These poems are entirely political. They have a second message. For example, Narod Narod, which is about the Congress and the Muslim League quarreling and making up temporarily. Alladi is about the three Indian statesmen, Lala Lajpat Rai, Lal Bahadur Shastri, and Bipin Chandra Pal, and so on. So we have other things like cultural poems, arts and sciences, philosophical. For example, it's kind of hard to understand why Bhuture Khala would be about arts and sciences. It's actually about paintings by Awarindanath Thakur, which were mocked in that poem. It's kind of hard to appreciate these things. So I would refer you to my book, which you can see on the top right. This is not the translation, the slim 82-page book. This is a 256-page book, which actually goes and dissects these poems as to their inner meanings. So that's the importance to comparative literature. And with that, I come essentially to the end of my presentation. So in conclusion, translations need to be approached with a purpose or scopus in mind. The purpose and relevance to your target audience readership determine policy. The tighter your policy, the more difficult are your challenges. Sensum pro sensu approach is important for equivalence and author intent. Adequacy is a superset of equivalence, and it provides situational context. In our case, it provided the mood which was missing with pure equivalence. Verbum pro verbo must be evaluated to avoid unintended consequences of not understanding hidden meanings. Remember, our job is to recode what the author intended, never to interpret it. We don't want to say it was well meant. We don't know whether it was well meant. We just recode in a different language what the author wrote in the target language, what the author wrote in the source language. And we also know for poetry, rhyme and meter help create a more fulfilling reader experience. Why fulfilling and why not faithful? Well, in modern translation theory, people have started to say things like, it is the task of the translator to liberate the original writer's words from the confines of the source language and give them new life in the target language. That's Octavio Paz. So if you adopt that kind of a philosophy, then faithfulness becomes something much more nebulous. But this is the end of my presentation. I know I've exceeded time. To be fair to me, I wasn't anticipating a long time in the introductions, which also happened, but I am ready for questions if you have the time. Dr. Shen?
Thank you for your lecture, but I want to ask you a question.
Sure.
You said that rhyme and meter are very important while translating Sukumar Ray's poetry. And without rhyme and meter, the poetry is not of that standard as Sukumar Ray wanted to get it. But I want to know that do you think that mere paraphrasing of the ideas will be able to capture Sukumar Ray's intended ideas?
It's a complex question because you need to mute your mic, I guess. Please mute your mic. Yeah, otherwise you'll get echoes. So that's a complex question because during the process of asking that question, you move from words to ideas. Those are two different things. But I'll break it up into words and ideas and try to answer that to the best of my ability. Now, when I say that you need both rhyme and rhythm and meter, that's a personal preference. If I were to have to translate the ideas, I didn't even need to do poetry. I could have translated the ideas in prose. So the question was, what was the original author intending to communicate? If all that the original author was intending to communicate was information, then perhaps he could have written it in prose, and he chose to write it in poetry. But since the only thing that is being conveyed is information, I can choose to write it in any way I want. So yes, if I were doing just the ideas, I can even write it in prose. Does it do justice to the creation of the author? The author in this case did not write a letter to you, send communication. There was creation, which included things like, this is the reaction that I'm going to get when somebody reads it. They are going to feel the cadence. They're going to laugh at the humor, and they'll be happy because there's a certain mood that I've created. Now, I can create the humor in prose. I can create the mood in prose. I cannot create the cadence unless I have the rhyme and the rhythm. So it's a matter of personal preference. And that's why the reason why I said that your question is complex, because if it were a matter of the words and what the author created, then rhyme and rhythm are very important. If it's a matter of the ideas, it doesn't matter which way I explain it. Does that answer the question? Or if you have a follow-up question, I'm happy to answer that if I can.
No, I thought that's enough. That's a sufficient answer for me. Any question from anybody else?
I'm guessing not.
If there is no question, we can move over to our next phase of the session. Shubhalokhi, please.
Uh, okay, sir. Am I audible to you all?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Sir, starting from the sense, nonsense, dream, reality, in a journey called growing up, gradually learning to control the eternal child, but Abol Tabol breaks the barrier and takes us to a dreamy world. Good evening, everyone. I, Shubhalakshmi Paul, Assistant Professor of this college for the Department of Economics. I am honored and lucky enough to have the opportunity to give the vote of thanks on this special day, special moment on your lecture. I particularly like our speaker, Dr. Niladri Roy, where he mentioned the importance of the Abol Tabol tablet and how much its innovative concept that Sukumar Ray used at that time, especially Sir explained his subject area in an extraordinary way. Basically, Niladri sir takes out his magic brush and paints this beautiful picture with his word. Thank you, sir. And initially, I convey my thanks to our principal, sir, Dr. Pradeep Kumar Maiti. You have been constant support and have given us a lot of encouragement. Thank you, sir. And I would like to thanks all of these organizing team members, convener of the seminar committee, Dr. Joyita Banerjee, and other teachers, staff members who engaged with these activities directly. And our special thanks to our IQAC coordinator, Sir Dr. Sandipon Sen, for his constant support. Finally, again, I want to thanks to our speaker, principal sir, and respected professor, and beloved our student and participating in this seminar, and other participant also who just joined in our seminar. Thank you, everyone. I